My name is Dan Carpenter. I am a professor of government here in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, and I chair the government department as well. And most important, I was privileged and honored to work with Radcliffe and the Harvard University Native American program under the able leadership of Joe Gaughan to help coordinate this conference. It was an honor. I'm especially honored now to introduce to you the Dean of the Radcliffe Institute, Tomiko Brown-Nagin. The Radcliffe Institute is one of the world's leading research centers across the humanities, the sciences, the social sciences, and the arts, and for that matter, the professions. And Tomiko is its able leader, and she's been visionary in many respects. More on that in a moment. She's also the Daniel P.S. Paul Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard Law School and a professor of history in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Let me tell you a little bit first about Professor Brown-Nagin's really amazing scholarly career. Tomiko, if I may, is an award-winning legal historian and an expert in constitutional law and education law and policy. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Law Institute, and the American Philosophical Society. She's also a fellow of the American Bar Foundation, and she's a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. She's also a member of the editorial board of the American Journal of Constitutional History, and she serves on the board of directors of ProPublica. Her latest book is quite a landmark. It's entitled Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley and the Struggle for Equality. It explores the life and times of the path-breaking lawyer, politician, and judge, Constance Baker Motley. The New Yorker, the Los Angeles Times, the Smithsonian Magazine, and Time all cited it as one of the best books of 2022. And Civil Rights Queen is also the winner of the 2023 Darlene Clark Hine Award and the 2023 Lillian Smith Book Award, as well as a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award. It was also shortlisted for a number of other major literary prizes and optioned for a documentary film treatment that I'm looking forward to seeing. Her previous book, Courage to Dissent, is no less a landmark. Courage to Dissent, Atlanta and the Long History of the Civil Rights Movement, won a 2012 Bancroft Prize in American History, also won the Liberty Legacy Prize of the Organization of American Historians, and the John Philip Reed Book Award by the American Society of Legal History, among other honors. More recently, from 2019 to 2022, Dean Brown-Nagin chaired the Presidential Committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery, and that was a really critical effort that informs, in part, what we're doing here and in the future. As chair of that committee, she led the highly visible university-wide initiative and also co-authored the committee's landmark report that detailed the university's direct financial and intellectual ties to slavery. The effort resulted in Harvard's unprecedented commitment of $100 million to redress harms to descendant communities in the United States and the Caribbean. Harvard University Press published the report in a book form in the fall of 2022. Lauded in the Washington Post and in the New York Times the New York Review of Books, for its scholarly breadth and depth, the report has been nominated for several academic prizes. So this is a remarkably talented and energetic individual, I think we can all agree. But let me just say, having worked at Radcliffe, I've experienced Tomiko as an indefatigable leader with a passionate commitment to engage scholarship and to the very communities who are at the heart of our discussion today. Tomiko?
Good morning, everyone. So lovely to see you, and thank you, Dan, for that kind introduction. And thank you to Laughing Woman. the Vice Chairwoman of the Mashantucket Pequot Elders Council, for blessing us with that prayer, opening our convening today. I want to start by thanking and welcoming all of those who are stewards of the land, particularly the tribal nations and historic communities of the Commonwealth and New England, many of whom are represented today by leadership and honored guests. Thank you for being with us. It's my honor to welcome everyone to Radcliffe for the second day of our convening on legacies of Indigenous enslavement, indenture, and colonization at Harvard and beyond. Our conference began last night with a thought-provoking program featuring a keynote by Dallas Goldtooth, an activist, actor, organizer, writer, Dakota culture and language teacher, and founding member of the sketch comedy group, the 1491s. Now, as Dan mentioned, I had the honor of serving as chair of the faculty committee that led the first phase of the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery initiative, which was launched in 2019 by the university's 29th president, Lawrence S. Bacow, and anchored here at the Radcliffe Institute. In that work, the committee examined Harvard's past in order to lay a foundation for repair. And we released our findings and recommendations for reparative work in April of 2022. Recognizing the particular significance of Indigenous history, one of those recommendations called upon the university to, quote, honor, engage, and support Native communities through a range of efforts, including the organization of a landmark conference to promote research, foster new partnerships, and further national dialogue about the history of colonialism and Indigenous enslavement and their legacies, and that is why we are here today. As the committee report documents, Harvard's early history is deeply entwined with its broader historical context, in which slavery was a vital part of colonial Massachusetts society and economy. Indeed, the first code overseeing slavery in British North America originated in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That code, the 1641 Body of Liberties, permitted the enslavement and trade of African and Indigenous human beings. In fact, as the committee's report states, slavery began when early colonists enslaved and sold Indigenous people, while dispossessing these native peoples of the land on which they had lived for generations. Harvard's report further documented that university affiliates, including a Harvard president and several of the university's earliest overseers, enslaved Indigenous people. These enslaved human beings included Lucy, held in bondage by a Harvard steward in the 18th century, and Titus, who records indicate was of Indigenous and possibly African descent as well. Titus lived and worked not far from here in Wadsworth's house, where he was enslaved by Harvard President Benjamin Wadsworth. A plaque now remembers Titus and his life, alongside that of Venus, Bilhah, and Juba, who were of African descent and enslaved by university presidents residing in Wadsworth House. On the names of other Native individuals held in bondage by Harvard leaders, the historical record is often painfully silent. Yet the significance of Indigenous history at Harvard extends beyond the conduct of individual affiliates. The education and religious conversion of Native students was a component of the college's original mission, as established in the Charter of 1650 that governs Harvard to this very day. This commitment reflected broader colonial endeavors to Christianize Indigenous peoples, and its inclusion was politically and financially beneficial to the university. Despite its pledge to educate Native students and the subsequent construction of the so-called Indian College building in 1655, Harvard enrolled only 5 Native students during this period. And only one of these students, Caleb Chishantiamak, received a degree in his lifetime. His portrait now hangs in Annenberg Hall. By 1690, the Indian College building was taken down and its bricks repurposed for white scholars. A plaque placed by the Harvard University Native American program near where the Indian College once stood in Harvard Yard commemorates the college and its students. The legacies of these histories remain with us today, not only in the memorials across campus, but also in the form of cultural artifacts and human remains held by the university's museums, as documented by Harvard Steering Committee on Human Remains in University Museum collections in fall of 2022. And this past January, Harvard completed the legal process to repatriate the remains of 313 Native people to Mashpee and Wampanoag. The critical work of repatriation continues here and at institutions beyond Harvard. Now, Harvard is not alone in its efforts to reckon honestly with its history. In recent decades, institutions in the United States and across the globe have begun to examine and work to remedy their historical entanglements with slavery and its enduring effects. Such reckoning must include, and too often does not include, overlooked histories and legacies of Indigenous enslavement, indenture, and dispossession. In undertaking this work, it is essential to elevate, examine, and honor the experiences of Native communities. That is our focus today. Our first session will examine enslavement, indenture, and dispossession, followed by a second session focusing specifically on colonization in New England. We'll then break for lunch, after which we'll have a keynote by environmental and Indigenous rights advocate Tara Hauska, a citizen of Couchiching First Nation. Then, our final session of the day is dedicated to Harvard and Massachusetts tribal repair. At various points in the program, we'll also hear from university representatives from the University of British Columbia, the University of California, Los Angeles, and Stanford. They will share challenges and successes from their work undertaken to rebuild and repair relationships with tribal communities. We welcome your questions throughout the program. Whether you're watching us in person or online, you can submit questions using Slido. Link is provided behind me on the screen and posted in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar. Before I welcome our first speakers to the stage, I'd like to offer some additional thanks. I'm grateful to my colleagues at the Harvard University Native American program for leading this conference. I'd also like to thank by name the members of the conference planning committee, Joseph Pigon of the Onegrovant Tribe of Montana, and faculty director of UNEP, Kelly Mosteler, a citizen of Potawatomi Nation and UNEP executive director, Megan Hill of Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and Senior Director of the Project on Indigenous Governance and Development and Director of Honoring Nations Program at Harvard Kennedy School. Tobias Vanderhoop of the Wampanoag Tribe of Gayhead, Aquina. David Weeden, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Tribal Councilman of the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. Cable Wilkerson, a citizen of Potawatomi Nation and a doctoral candidate in Harvard's Department of History. Daniel Carpenter, my colleague in the government department. And Rebecca Wasserman, Executive Director of Academic Ventures and Engagement here at Radcliffe. I'm also grateful to HUNAP and Radcliffe staff, including Jordan Clark, Kaylee Bennett, Rebecca Wasserman's team in Academic Ventures and Engagement, and Jessica Vicklin and the entire Radcliffe Events team for all of their contributions to today's program. Let me also thank again Harvard's former president, Lawrence Bacow, for his commitment to truth and to change in launching the Legacy of Slavery initiative. And thank you to President Gay, Provost Garber, and Vice Provost Sarah Bleich for the ongoing work on this initiative. Finally, I want to sincerely thank all of our speakers and moderators for joining us, the tribal leaders and elders who are honoring us with their presence today, and everyone in our audience for engaging in this critically important dialogue. And now I'm pleased to kick off our first panel, which is moderated by my colleague, award-winning historian Taya Miles. Taya is a Radcliffe alumni professor and a current fellow here at the Radcliffe Institute. She's also the Michael Garvey Professor of History in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and Taya was a member of the Presidential Committee that issued the Harvard and Legacy of Slavery's report and landmark report. Taya will introduce our panelists in just a moment, so please join me in welcoming all of them to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning to those of us who are in this room together. Good morning to everybody who's watching or listening virtually online. My name is Taya Miles. I am a member of the History Department here, and as Dean Brown-Nagin said, I was a member of the Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery Committee, and that has been the most momentous, meaningful effort that I've been involved in since coming back to Harvard around 5 years ago. I have the privilege of introducing and moderating our first panel of the day, which is entitled Enslavement, Indenture, and Dispossession. Before I offer an overview of our format, I just want to acknowledge that we are living in very, very difficult times, and that is an extreme understatement. We walk with the weight and the burden of so much pain. And I, for one, was relieved to hear and take part of the beautiful prayer this morning. It helped me to get a good breath. I was relieved to hear that beautiful song yesterday evening. And I feel so privileged to be here with you because it feels like we're here together. It feels like we're here and we are ready to wrestle with some of these very, very challenging issues that are rooted in a long and tortured and traumatic past. So our format for this session is that I'm going to do a brief introduction. Our panelists will each speak for 10 to 12 minutes. I'll ask a few follow-up questions, and then I'll turn to audience questions. Audience members are, as you have heard, welcome to submit questions at any time during the session by way of the Slido app. And there's a QR code behind me, and there's a link in the chat if you're watching online. Although it still comes as a surprise to many people, slavery in the lands that are now known as the United States spanned all geographies, northern, eastern, and western, as well as the more familiar to the narrative southern terrain. People of European origins, African descent, and indigenous communities and nationalities participated in systems of human bondage as perpetrators, victims, and resistors. This fundamental, widespread, and entrenched practice did not fully disappear with the formal abolition of slavery following the Civil War. Slavery has left its stamp on modern relationships, on the shape of governments and institutions, the demographics of places, the features of our built environment, and the interactive and interpersonal shadows of everyday life. As you just heard from Dean Brown-Nagin, this conference on Indigenous histories and lands emerges from an initiative that has studied and seeks to redress Harvard's legacy with slavery. You've also heard that the enslavement of Indigenous peoples occurred first here in this region. Native, Black, and Afro-Native peoples were brought together in many cases during this dark chapter of slavery. It is the link that connects Native and Black pasts, and it is a hinge that opens our discussion of history, harm, and the possibilities of repair. Our aim for this panel is to place these many interconnected issues into historical context, regional as well as hemispheric. Native slavery and indenture are painful but necessary topics with which to begin as we explore colonization of Native lands, the repression and the theft of Native cultural ways, the Indigenous defense of homelands and families, and the afterlives of these tumultuous colonial times. So now to introduce our wonderful panelists for this morning. Andres Resendez is a professor of history at UC Davis. He is the author of 4 books, including The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and a winner of the Bancroft Prize from Columbia University. David Silverman is a professor of history at George Washington University. He is the author of several books, his most recent being This Land is Their Land, The Wampanoag Indians, Plymouth Colony, and The Troubled History of Thanksgiving. His essays have won major awards from the Omohundro Institute and the New York Association of History. Margaret Newell is the College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor in the Department of History at The Ohio State University. Her most recent book, Brethren by Nature, New England Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery, won the James Raleigh Prize on Race Relations from the Organization of American Historians and the Peter Gones Memorial Prize from the Massachusetts Historical Society. And David Weeden is a tribal councilman and a tribal historic preservation officer of the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe. He is a Native American representative to the Assembly of Delegates at the Cape Cod Commission, and he served as an elected official on the planning board of the town of Mashpee. Additional information about all of our speakers is available on the webpage for this conference. And so now I'll turn it over to Andres Resendez to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Thank you for being here. It is an honor and a pleasure. So in this wise design, we will begin with big picture. So I want to go through 6 or 7 main points that I want to make as we consider this long history of enslavement in this continent. And the first point is that slavery existed in the American continent well before the arrival of Europeans. We can find traces of these ancient practices of human bondage carved in stones, in Zapotec and Maya structures, or in 16th century codices, like these beautiful Mendoza Codex, or in words for slave or captive in indigenous languages, which all provide us additional clues. And of course, letters and reports by early Europeans contain many descriptions of slaving practices, like the famous Morning Wars waged against rival native nations to procure captives, or the exchanging of slaves to finalize elite marriages in what is now the Pacific Northwest, or perhaps in open-air Aztec markets where captives were bought and sold. So clearly, the enslavement of indigenous peoples was not a European invention, point number one. But, and this is the second point, with the arrival of Europeans, these pre-existing practices of bondage, originally embedded in very specific cultural contexts, became commercialized and expanded in unexpected ways. This transformation began with the earliest European explorers. Columbus himself, during his second voyage to America in 1493, sent dozens of natives from the Caribbean to the Iberian Peninsula, and accompanying them was a candid letter addressed to the Spanish monarchs. And let me quote one line from that letter to give you a flavor. "May your highnesses judge whether these Indians ought to be captured, for I believe we could take many of the males every year, and an infinite number of women. And may you also believe that one of them would be worth more than 3 black slaves from Guinea in strength and ingenuity, as you will gather from those I am shipping out now." End of quote. Over the next few decades, all European powers became participants in the trafficking of Native Americans. The Portuguese, the French, the English, the Dutch, but Spain, by virtue of the enormous and densely populated colonies that it ruled in the American continent, became the dominant slaving power. Spain was to indigenous slavery what Portugal and later England were to African slavery. In these decades, Europeans built networks of enslavement that would have been completely, utterly unimaginable prior to contact. And here I'm showing you a map of some of these. By the 17th century, Mapuche people from southern Chile, as you can see down there, were being marched to the port of Valparaiso and shipped all the way to the mines of Peru. Apaches from what is now the American Southwest were taken as far south as Cuba and as far north as Canada. Slaves from the Malabar Coast in the Indian subcontinent were transported across the vast Pacific to work in cities and mines in North America. The scope of these networks of enslavement is simply breathtaking. Second point, who exactly were these native slaves? Well, most probably, most of them were women and children. This preference is reflected in historical sale prices, as native women could be worth up to 50 or 60% more than male indigenous slaves, a premium for women that existed the same in the Caribbean that in Chile or in New Mexico, and it could be observed from the 16th century all the way to the 19th centuries. Sexual exploitation and women's reproductive capabilities are part of the reason for this preference. Some sources also point to the convenience of having females rather than males in the domestic sphere. And just as masters wanted docile women, they also showed a clear preference for native children who were more adaptable than grown-ups, learned languages more easily, and in the fullness of time, could even come to identify with their captors, becoming menials, servants, and with some luck, attain some independence and a higher status even during a lifetime. Now here's point number 3. One of the most striking features of indigenous slavery, at least in the Spanish context, in the Spanish imperial context, was its illegality. So unlike African slavery, which was sanctioned by all European colonial powers and remained legal for centuries, indigenous slavery was controversial from the start. During the early 16th century, the Spanish Empire allowed the enslavement of Native Americans only in certain circumstances. For example, like when finding cannibalistic indigenous peoples, then that was considered such a terrible sin that the only way to correct that was by enslaving people. So these were special circumstances, but after 1542, the Spanish crown prohibited the practice of slavery completely. And so let me quote from this law. It says, "From here on, no Indian can be made into a slave under any circumstance, including wars, rebellions, or when ransomed from some other Indians." This categorical prohibition, however, did not stop the Spanish colonists from taking native slaves on a truly planetary scale. Instead, this law made the practice clandestine and extraordinarily difficult to stamp out. Those who held Native Americans as slaves resorted to a variety of labor arrangements, terms, and subterfuges to get around the law while retaining their mastery over their slaves. This is the main reason why the enslavement of indigenous peoples has been so difficult to recognize in documents in the historical record. Naked enslavement mutated first into imperial and seigneurial institutions like encomiendas and repartimientos, and later on into economic-based forms of bondage like convict leasing and debt peonage, until such arrangements came to resemble the kinds of human trafficking that are recognizable to us today. It is tempting to think of indigenous enslavement as a phenomenon of the early colonial period, and yet a set of practices that, fell into disuse once African slaves became available in the Americas in sufficient numbers. In reality, indigenous slavery in its many guises coexisted with African slavery all along. And this is one estimate that I provide of the numbers, and I will get back to that in the end. One of the most fascinating aspects of the phenomenon of Indian slavery is, of course, the involvement of Native Americans themselves. They were part of the slaving enterprise from the very beginning, offering captives to European explorers and serving as guides, guardsmen, and intermediaries, local providers, and junior partners. But as Native Americans acquired European weaponry and horses, they increased their power and came to control the traffic of natives in some regions of the continent. In the llanos of Colombia and Venezuela, for instance, the so-called Carib people, Kalinga people, who had suffered greatly at the hands of Spanish slavers because they were believed to be cannibalistic, consolidated their position as the principal suppliers of slaves to the nearby French, English, and Dutch colonies by the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Powerful indigenous societies and what is now the American Southwest, like Utes and Comanches, serve much the same function, taking horseless indigenous peoples from the Great Basin, like Paiutes, and selling them in the fairs of New Mexico. The phenomenon of Indian slavery engulfed the entire American continent, but the timing varied depending on the region. By the 19th century, Indian slavery had nearly disappeared in the eastern coast of North America. In colonial times, the Carolinas had been a major Indian slaving ground. New Englanders had impressed indigenous slaves, as we will hear, etc. Yet during the 18th century, the traffic of Native Americans was often replaced by African slavery in the eastern seaboard, even though some of these practices remain in places. In the American West, however, the enslavement of indigenous peoples continued to thrive during the 19th century. And the best evidence can be found in letters and diaries of westbound Americans. In New Mexico, for example, James S. Calhoun, the first Indian agent of the territory, could not hide his amazement at the sophistication of the Indian slave market that he found there. And I quote him, "The value of the captives depends upon age, sex, beauty, and usefulness. Good-looking females, not having passed the sear and yellow leaf, are valued from $50 to $150 each. Males as they may be useful one half less, never more. So persistent was Indian slavery that ending it proved nearly impossible. The Spanish crown had prohibited native bondage under all circumstances in 1542, yet the traffic continued. Another attempt at abolition occurred in the early 19th century when the newly independent Republic of Mexico proscribed all forms of native enslavement and extended citizenship rights to Native Americans born in Mexico, yet Indian slavery persisted. One more opportunity arose immediately after Civil War. The United States Congress passed the 13th and 14th Amendments, the 13th Amendment that prohibited both slavery and involuntary servitude, yet it also continued. The written word was simply not enough to eliminate practices that were deeply entrenched. Forms of Indian slavery continued throughout the 19th century and in some remote areas of the American West well into the 20th century. The enslavement of indigenous peoples was hardly a marginal phenomenon. According to my own estimates, anywhere between 2.5 and 5 million Native Americans were enslaved throughout our hemisphere in the centuries between the arrival of Columbus and the beginning of the 20th century. And yet, many unsuspecting citizens of the United States and elsewhere in Latin America are not even aware of that this happened. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andres. And now David Silverman will speak.
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be with all of you here today. I'd like to begin my talk with a story, and it's based on what I consider to be one of the most incredible documentary accounts from 17th century New England. In June 1675, some 54 years after his father, Usamiquin, or Massasoit, had greeted the Pilgrims, the Wampanoag sachem, or chief Pemedicom, sat down to talk with a delegation of English magistrates from the colony of Rhode Island. And you can see where that talk took place on the map behind me. The Rhode Islanders were there to encourage the sachem to agree to a peaceful arbitration of the Wampanoags' mounting tensions with Plymouth Colony. My reading of this episode is that Pemedicom had already resolved to fight and agreed to this conference only to explain why. In some of my previous writings, I contend that a series of sachems in southern New England had worked for decades to unite the tribes, despite their differences, into a league to fight back against the shared threat of colonialism. The Narragansett, Mayantonomo, began the effort in the early 1640s. Then, in the 1650s, the torch of leadership passed to Ninigret, the Niantic Narragansett sachem, after which it passed again in the 1660s, first to Pemedicom's brother, Wamsutta, and finally to Pemedicom himself. Some scholars question whether Native people really were coordinating an anti-colonial campaign, given that the records of it were generated by colonists intent on subjugating and dispossessing the supposed plotters. But in my mind, there is so much evidence, including secondhand Native accounts from so many different interests, that I'm convinced the charge was real. Furthermore, there is a centuries-long, continent-wide pattern of Native peoples forming such coalitions against colonialism. Rarely, however, do we have statements by their leadership about their reasons. I'd like us to consider what Pemedicom said on that June day of 1675. And by the way, I suspect that this conversation was taking place in Wampanoag. He had quite a list of grievances. For instance, he charged Plymouth with having seized and, he alleged, fatally poisoned his brother, Wamsutta, or Alexander as the English called him, back in 1662, because the English feared his intertribal intrigue. More recently, the English had the testimony of some Christian Indians and used it to arrest, try, and execute 3 of Pemedicom's men for the supposed murder of another Christian Indian, John Sassaman, who briefly attended Harvard, who had been informing on Pametacom to colonial authorities. To Pametacom, Plymouth Colony's executions of the accused Sassaman murderers and its presumed assassination of Wamsutta encapsulated a vast array of English wrongs. He denounced, and by the way, stick with me with the language, it's a bit staggered. He denounced that in English courts, and I quote, "If 20 honest Indians testified that an Englishman had done them wrong, it was as nothing. And if but one of the worst Indians testified against any Indian suspected by the English, that was sufficient." Worse yet, the English had begun to interfere in criminal matters between Wampanoags within Wampanoag territory, as in the Sassaman case. Pametacom railed, and I quote again, "Whatever was only between Indians and not in English townships, they would not have us prosecute." About half of the Wampanoags, mostly on Cape Cod and the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, had adopted Christianity and cut off their tribute payments to Pametacom, fearing no reprisal from him because they enjoyed English protection. The English routinely plied native people with drink, then got them to sign land deeds, then used the writing to claim even more land than the native signatories had agreed to in their cups. When Indians resisted, colonists flooded the contested tracts with livestock and slapped any native people who injured the animals with criminal fines, lawsuits, and the seizure of yet more land. Such machinations gave the colonists, as Pametacom put it, and I quote, 100 times more land than now the king, referring to himself, had for his people. The Rhode Islanders offered to set up mediation to address these complaints, but Pametacom, having been through that charade before, was certain that the English would just use some technical violation to seize more of his land and perhaps even execute him. He could see no peaceful, mutually acceptable end to this impasse. Peace would just mean the colonists' continued reduction of the Wampanoags and other native people to landlessness, servitude, and subjugation to English religion and authority. Pametacom summed up his speech by stressing that when the English first settled at Plymouth, more than 50 years earlier, his father, Usamiquin, and I quote, was as a great man, and the English as a little child. Pametacom contended, and he was right, that Usamiquin could have wiped out the infant colony if he had wished. Instead, he held back its native enemies, fed the starving colonists, and granted them land, as a father would his own child. And how did Plymouth show its gratitude now that it had become the great man? It exploited the Wampanoags in every way it could contrive. The Rhode Islanders, seeing where this conversation was headed, cautioned Pametacom that it would be suicidal for the Wampanoags to resort to arms, because they said, and I quote, the English were too strong for them. In that case, the sachem retorted, and I quote, then the English should do to them, the Wampanoags, as they did when they were too strong for the English. And that's where the conversation ended, because everyone knew this wish was futile. Pametacom knew the odds were against any Indians who took up the fight against the English. And not only because of the colonists' superior numbers, comparative unity, vast resources, and utter ruthlessness, but also because of their historic success at dividing native people against one another. And true enough, King Philip's War, like almost every major colonial Indian contest, became a struggle between an anti-colonial league of various native people, in this case including Wampanoags, Nipmucs, Narragansetts, and Wabanakis, against another coalition of colonists and their native allies, in this case including Mohegans, Pequots, Praying Indians near Boston, Christian Wampanoags, and eventually the Mohawks, who made this torturous decision so that their children might live. The war resulted in the large-scale death, dispossession, and as I'm sure Margaret Newell will address, enslavement of the anti-colonial forces and their families. But it is the long-term fate of those Native people who survived the war, because of their grudging support of the English, that helps to explain why Pametacom rose up in the first place. I contend, and this is the thrust of my comments here today, that over the next 150 years, debt peonage and servitude became the dominant features of their struggles with colonialism. With colonists having seized most of their land, Native people increasingly could not make ends meet without purchases of food and clothes from the English. But that also meant that they struggled to pay back their debts. English creditors, with the full cooperation of colony-appointed guardians and the courts, exploited this vulnerability, forcing Wampanoags and other Native people, sometimes informally, but often through the justice system, into the most dangerous and degrading jobs in the colonial economy. For men, that meant whaling, military service, and farming labor. For women, it meant toiling as house servants and nannies. The pattern was reinforced by colonists and later white Americans' use of the criminal courts to sentence Native people to servitude, often based on patently false charges. Margaret has, I think, aptly called this pattern judicial servitude, and I think that brings a great, judicial slavery, rather, and I think that brings enormous clarity to this pattern. The result was that the vast majority of able-bodied Native people lived and worked among whites, not in their own communities, from the late 1600s through the early 1800s. And not just able-bodied adults, but children too. The courts routinely took children from Native debtors and the criminally charged and bound them out as servants to whites until adulthood, well into adulthood. Furthermore, many desperate parents bound out their children on their own, whether to fend off creditors, they had to provide for the rest of their kids too, or in an attempt to provide for the children's basic needs. So to repeat, I see this debt peonage as the defining characteristic of Native life in the post-King Philip's War era between 1680 and 1820. I think what I've said is awful enough, but its awfulness becomes even more pronounced when we consider two of its features. One is that nearly all of the victims were Christian, and members of groups that had proven to be the colonists' most steadfast Native allies in times of war. When the English founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, as we've heard multiple times, they claimed that evangelizing Native people and bringing them into colonial society was their primary purpose. Harvard's enrollment of Indigenous scholars was part of that campaign. As it turned out, and as Pametacom foresaw, the result was Indian dispossession and servitude. Colonists' treatment of their Indigenous co-religionists in this way, I contend, was a significant aspect of a multivalent process of race-making, of defining what it meant to be white and Indian in America. The second feature of Native debt peonage that I want to flag, and I will close on this theme, is the decline of the Wampanoag language during the post-King Philip's War era. Now, let me mention, the reason I thought to probe this issue in the first place when I first entered this field as a graduate student and got to know the Aquinnah Wampanoag community was that the Wampanoags were in the early stages of their current language revitalization program. Truly one of the more inspiring and fascinating developments that I've had the privilege to witness in my adult life. It opened my eyes in the written record to fleeting references of Native people returning home after years and even decades of servitude, unable to speak their native language. Now, let's be clear, there were other factors at play here in the decline of these languages. And by decline, I mean what some Wampanoag people today call going to sleep, given that they're currently waking up the language. Those other factors include intermarriage and, eventually, as I've learned from Wampanoag people, sometimes a deliberate attempt by some parents to make their children monolingual English, to give them a better shot at life. But the main factor, I contend, was generations of servitude among white people, especially of children. No wonder Pametacom made the choice that he did. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And now we'll hear from Margaret Newell.
Well, good morning, everybody. Just as a warning, I'm going to be talking about some hard things, disturbing things. But I'm also going to be trying to take it from maybe the big picture to the more local picture of enslavement in New England, an occasional Harvard connection, and also individual stories of how some of the indigenous groups from this region experienced enslavement and servitude. So I'm starting off with this beautiful map from Lisa Brooks's website around her book, The Common Pot. Highly recommend. Because it's got all the tribal nations, but also the indigenous place names for waterways, for land. And what's interesting about New England is it kept a lot of those indigenous names, place names, for states, for rivers, but erased the historical experience of the people who lived here. So one of the first mentions of Harvard in print was in a 1643 work called New England's First Fruits. And this was a kind of a piece of propaganda aimed at English audiences who were starting to get a little concerned about events in Massachusetts Bay. Many of these early investors in the Massachusetts Bay Company had religious reasons for their investment, and one of the rationales for the colony was evangelization of Native Americans. Instead, they were hearing reports of warfare, of massacres of Pequot Indians at Mystic, of various sorts of religious intolerance towards other English people. So this was an attempt to correct course and get make New England look good, make Massachusetts look good in the eyes of these investors. And but they really didn't have anything to offer on the evangelization front. They hadn't really been engaged in any evangelization of Native Americans, except for the Pequot captives, over 318 people, mostly women and children, that they had taken from their homes, on the battlefield, dragged out of places of refuge, and had brought into their homes as domestic servants, slaves. People with no term, no contract, nothing that was really going to explain or limit the extent of their servitude. So the author of New England's First Fruits is a little bit hard to determine. Some people think it was the first president of Harvard, Henry Dunster. But two other likely co-authors are Hugh Peter and Thomas Weld, who is the minister of First Roxbury Church. And both Hugh Peter and Thomas Weld had Pequot captives in their households. So in First Fruits, the captives are held up as idealized servants. They are painful in their labors, which meant they tried hard. They delight in everything English. They prefer it to their Native American ways. They're learning English. They're praying in secret, although we don't know what God they were praying to. Now, this fictionalized version of the pleasures of servitude for all of these Pequot children was belied a little bit by the reality of the experience of Hugh Peters' enslaved Pequot woman, Hope. Hope was a rebellious servant. Hugh Peter placed her in his home in Salem, at a farm in Marblehead. Hope drank. Hope ran away multiple times. She talked back. She resisted in many ways. And Hope suffered consequences for this resistance. She was whipped publicly in Boston at the town whipping post by the town beadle, in Marblehead, and in Salem. She was tortured, basically, for her resistance. Thomas Weld's native girl, and that's how they referred to her, it was Mr. Weld's captive, Nan, died in captivity in about 9 years into her captivity. And we don't know whether Weld would have freed her at some point or whether she would have labored in his household for the entire period. So my argument is that the presence of these Pequot captives was one of the reasons why Massachusetts published this law of slavery in 1641 that the dean has already referred to. and also to establish their legal enslavement, but also the enslavement of Africans that Massachusetts received in exchange for Pequot captives. So Nan and Hope ended up working in Massachusetts, but 17 Pequots were actually sent to an island off the coast of Nicaragua, another Puritan colony called Providence Island. Others ended up in the island of Nevis, working on tobacco plantations, presumably, and maybe eventually on cane plantations, backbreaking work in Caribbean slavery. But in addition to this statute that really defines slavery for all people in Massachusetts and in the rest of the New England colonies for the next 150 years, I think we can look to also local laws that were passed in place like Connecticut and Massachusetts that really empowered the English colonists to convert people to slavery for a variety of infractions, that empowered the creation of what I might even call slave patrols to hunt down people who were accused of trespassing or for damaging livestock or fences or for sheltering runaway captives, which could be punishable by enslavement of those who helped fugitives. So, you know, there's an atmosphere created in which enslavement was a punishment that could be visited upon Native people by ordinary English people. So this idea that Indians were enslavable starts spreading into outside of warfare and into just the normal interactions between these two groups. So I wanted to tell a little story about another way that people could be enslaved, and that was really just simply through kidnapping. So the top of this slide shows a little court records, two just very simple lines that Mall Indian being brought into court by John Haythorne, an ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Edward Richards. The court ordered that she return to her master, John Bishop. Boom. So this girl had run away. She's returned to her master. Well, the story ends up being a lot more complicated than that simple line. Moll was actually kidnapped from Nantucket. She ran away. Someone picked her up on the road and took her to John Haythorne because John Haythorne ran the local tavern, sort of a public place, dropped her off. He was also a justice of the peace and said, you deal with the situation. So they notified her slaveholder, her master, John Bishop, who made plans to come and pick her up. But in the meantime, John Haythorne actually talked to Moll, or as well as he could, because he had to do so through an interpreter, because she didn't speak English. She was a Wampanoag girl from Nantucket. And he's very elliptical in what he found out, but he immediately feels that this girl cannot be returned to this home. There's a suggestion of sexual abuse. There's certainly suggestion that she's been kidnapped, that her parents have no idea where she is, that there's no actual indenture, that Bishop claims she's an indentured servant. There's no piece of paper that delimits a time limit or an agreement or any kind of exchange whatsoever. When Bishop comes to pick up the girl, there's a brawl. Haythorne, some other English people, really trying to fight against Bishop and the people he's brought to take this girl back. So the case goes to court, and what does the court do? It delivers Moll back to this man who's an abuser, who's a kidnapper, etc. And Haythorne, writes this appeal to the court in which he says, I should think it a hard measure to have the same done to any child of mine. That he actually sees her as a human being and as an equivalence in some ways to his own child. But that was a rare moment of empathy. And Haythorne himself was guilty of different sorts of abuse and enslavement of Indians or in his career as a justice of the peace as well. In the context of Metacomet Rebellion or King Philip's War, as David mentioned, enslavement was also a feature of Indigenous and English relations. And in the early stages of the war, a group of Christianized Native Americans, Nipmuc and residents of the Christian town of Oconomowoc were taken by a regiment of Massachusetts that was really about slaving and slave catching. Many of these colonial wars, became about enslaving Indians, but taking Indians captive. They started for a complex reason, but the progress and processes of these wars were about captivity and involved constant captive taking by armies, buying and selling people as they moved through the countryside. So these Native Americans were rounded up. One was tortured. to get more names of people to suggest. They were brought into Boston in coffles. And then the Boston authorities held this crazy court where they had sentenced all the men to slavery. And then they asked their wives, did they want to go with them or not? And again, this was all done, but these were conversations in which many of the people didn't speak English. They were asked these impossible questions about an impossible future for most of them to imagine. Many thought that they were going to be sent to England to negotiate with the English king. Instead, they were sent to Tangier. So they were sent to Spanish slave markets where they were purchased by an English naval officer, and the men were deployed as galley slaves. They built this breakwater around the port of Tangier for the English, the stone walls that are shown in this map. But other Native Americans remained to work in New England households just as Nan and Moll and Hope had done. So a Harvard graduate, minister in Milton, went shopping for a Native American slave in 1679. He had already, Peter Thatcher had already added an English indentured servant, a teenage girl, to his household, but he wanted more. So he purchased both an enslaved African and an enslaved Native American. He named her Margaret. So, when you read this diary, you see the difference in treatment between the English servant, who has a delimited term, parents living in the area that are kind of keeping an eye on how she's being treated and so on, and how he treats Margaret. So when the English servant misbehaves, he talks to her. He sits down and has serious talks with her. When Margaret dropped their baby, he and his wife's baby, on the floor of the kitchen, he hit her with her frying pan. So there's sort of serious physical abuse being visited on Margaret and others. But I also want to talk about another aspect of New England Indian slavery, and something that connects to Andres' presentation, which is the importation of indigenous people from other regions. What I have here is an advertisement in a Boston newspaper that describes what I would call an uprising. It is a mass escape by Native Americans of Spanish and Carolinian, from Spanish and Carolinian locales. So these are indigenous people from the southeastern United States that have been trafficked out of South Carolina and sent all over the globe. So there's a reverse Middle Passage going on, as well as enslaved people being kept in New England. And New Englanders are also importing Indians, Native Americans, from other places. In this case, from La Florida, or from the Carolinas, because English colonization of Virginia and of the southeastern colonies was very slave-based. Enslavement was, how they paid for colonization, how they achieved colonization. 50 to 60,000 indigenous people from the southeastern portions of what is now the United States were enslaved. More Native Americans were being exported out of Charleston, South Carolina, than were being imported, than Africans were being imported there until about 1720. So, these people are working for tanners, they're working for clergymen. The minister of the First Anglican Church is listed here as a slaveholder of one of these Native Americans who escaped. 2 years later, another group of Spanish and Carolina Indians staged a giant group escape, one of whom belonged to Samuel Adams Maltster, the father of the Samuel Adams of the American Revolution fame. So I am over time. I was given strict instructions to kind of try to stay on track, but let me just talk about two other things very quickly, if the panel allows. One is to talk a little bit about what Samuel Sewall's diary can tell us about the experiences of individual Native New Englanders. Sewall kept a diary for 50 years, more or less, so you really see an arc, a historical arc. Sewall talks about Native American enslaved people throughout his diary. He encountered them almost every day. Native Americans drove the carriages that he and his family rode in the summer, and the sleighs that they rode in the winter. A Native American woman claimed by his girlfriend, Madam Winthrop, used to walk Sewall home after their dates with a lantern, guiding him back to his own home. Sewall attended auctions of Native Americans, Abnaki, Wabnaki, captured in warfare in the many wars that New Englanders engaged in with the Wabanaki people of the North between 1676 and 1748, where captives would be brought back and publicly auctioned right near where Faneuil Hall now stands. So these were daily, weekly, regular occurrences that he remarked on but didn't necessarily consider remarkable. But another thing that Sewell's diary tells us is the backstory to the changing nature of slavery in the Atlantic world and whether Massachusetts was going to march in lockstep with it or not. And one of these questions, or one of these areas, was whether slavery would become an inheritable status in Massachusetts, which is something that the people who claimed enslaved Africans wanted to have written into law, but was not written into Massachusetts law. So constantly there was pressure to change the law of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, bring it into conformity with what had become the practice of slavery elsewhere. And people like Sewell argued against that because they were okay with Africans being subject to hereditary slavery, but not Native Americans being subjected to hereditary slavery. So the presence of Africans changed the game for Native Americans, but the presence of Native Americans also meant that slavery operated in different ways, and that the enslaved retained rights, including the right to marry and the right to testify in court, that they lost in many other colonial settings. So I just wanted to end on one positive note, which was two cases in which people used their indigenous ancestry to claim freedom in the 18th century. Both involved Connecticut. One involved a young girl like Moll, who was a free person, an indentured servant under contract, who was basically trafficked to Connecticut and sold as a slave. And the bill of sale had turned her into a black person and a perpetual slave and erased her indigenous identity. She managed to return to Rhode Island, filed a lawsuit, got her freedom, and also filed a reparations claim, and won that claim as well. She inspired a similar suit by another enslaved man in Connecticut who also won his freedom based on his Native American parentage, and also sued for reparations and won. So if Connecticut and Rhode Island juries in the 18th century could consider restorative justice and reparations, maybe we can today too. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And next, David Weeden will speak.
That was a positive note. I didn't
Hello, everyone. We've heard from a lot of different people, academics and things, on how enslavement started and things like that. I wanted to put things in context and kind of draw a line of comparison to the ways of life that we once lived prior to colonization. You know, our way of life was that our children would grow up with us. We would spend quality time with the children, our grandmothers. There was generational interactions that's the way we learned, that's the way we lived. We had to teach them to respect the land, how to, only take what you need. Be thankful for all the gifts the Creator provided. This way of life sustained us for tens of thousands of years, since time immemorial. And that family way of learning, and we learn by observing, and we're mimics. That quality time, from a young age, the children, the grandmothers would spend time with them and identify different qualities within those children. And then they would be nurtured so that we had collective pockets of knowledge with the different societies that we had. And that was from spending quality time with your children and your families. And this all was sustainable to the point where, when the colonists arrived, they looked at everything and saw all these resources. And coming over here, that's what they looked at this country as, this abundance of resources that could be, they could make money off of. And from that point forward, everything that was done was built on the back of capitalism and try and disenfranchise the Native people of what they saw and what they could gain. And the irony that is with that, because, you know, peonage is something that was heavily used over in Europe. It was familiar all over the continent of Europe, and they brought that with them while they were trying to escape the persecution and oppressions. You know, the irony in that is just baffling, that they'd come over here and impose those things that they were escaping on the indigenous people here. And, you know, right from the beginning, they quickly outnumbered us. They came over by the thousands, and that exponentially went up from 1620 on, and to the point where we were outnumbered. And as you've heard earlier, you know, Usamiquin, we extended kindness to them and tried to help them in the first years, because we are a compassionate people. We are, because they brought women and children with them, we felt sympathy for them, because we looked at them as unknowing and kind of foolish. They couldn't even sustain themselves in this place with so much abundance. And so with that, you know, from that point forward, the corporate charters that were created, the Plymouth Colony and Mashpee Colony, it was always about dispossession, land dispossession. And everything that was done was to try and disenfranchise us from all that we had. By restricting the people to small reservations, Mashpee, I think, was 25 square miles originally, and we had about 250 people thereabouts in the tribe then. So the proportion of the amount of land that you needed to be able to live, hunting, fishing, materials for building your home and everything, you know, that you can factor that into the land that we needed to sustain ourselves. By reducing us to such a small footprint, and then, you know, you introduce alcohol and start doing land transactions to where that, you know, 25 square miles is diminished down to, I think today is 16 square miles. It's, we've lost a lot, you know, we've lost so much. And then to impose the indebtedness, the Cahoon Museum has logs of creditors' books and things, and it's clear and apparent of that indebtedness and peonage. And I reflect on some of the decisions that had to be made. You know, at times there was, at different points, there was every English household had an indentured servant or Native American as a not so much a slave, but the indentured servant. And when you read over the stories, you know, this is New England. There's a lot of written materials that are still in collections, so much so that, you know, we would love to have more resources to be able to do the research, to put together the exhibits to tell that story. But we're limited on our resources to do that type of research. But there's stories that I recall. You know, there was one where the young boy thought no one cared about him because his mom he was from Christiantown, and he thought his mom didn't care about him because he was indebted at a young age. That boy ended up working for, I think, 7 years or so, and eventually died. I think he died thinking that nobody cared about him, and an Englishman told him, you know, well, the Lord is your savior, you know, when others forsake you. So they used that indebtedness, the idea that parents were willing to commit their children to indenture as if they didn't care, to try to sell the word of gospel to us. And so, you know, it was weaponized. And that's bothersome in and of itself. But then there's other stories where I reflect on. My dad told a story where there was a young girl, I believe she was 16 years of age, I think her name was Margaret as well, where she was traded like livestock. And he talked about how in these written materials that he had discovered, he found where they were writing about, he was talking about how she was great for breeding. And you know, she was prime age for breeding and built for breeding and this sort of things. And she was traded as a commodity. You know, for people escaping oppression from Europe and everything and coming over here and then imposing this type of life on us, you know, reading over this material is really bothersome. It hurts, you know, to read over some of this stuff. And then going to the Revolutionary War, we had sent Reuben Cognew over to Europe, a Mohegan native that had come over and lived amongst us. We took him in as one of our own. He was a teacher. He saw what was going on in Mashpee, and, you know, he was an activist, so we sent him over to Europe to try to talk to the King of England, King George III, to give us, extend more sovereignty to us in self-governance. And his story in and of itself is a unique story and needs to be told as well, where he was actually put on a boat, but they didn't believe him that he was a delegate, and enslaved him. He went to the Caribbean. I think it ended up being 3 vessels that he traveled on before he ended up getting over to Europe and meeting with the king. The final one, he talked his way into convincing the captain that he was actually a delegate. He wasn't an enslaved person. And he made his way to England in 1763 and had a successful conversation with them to where they did extend a higher level of self-governance to the Mashpees. And we're thankful for his behalf, for him going over there and advocating and all that he went through to do that. But then a few years later, 1775, you know, when we go into the Revolutionary War, we had to make a decision. You know, do we fight on the side of the English or do we fight on the side of the colonists? And that decision had to be hard because the King of England had just extended a higher level of self-governance and removed some of the oppressors and overseers that the colony was imposing upon us. Yet we did still fight on the side of the colonists because we believed in the Bill of Goods that they were selling us with the Constitution, the promises in the Constitution and the civil rights and liberties and all these things that were going to be, you know, all men are created equal. And all men are entitled to equal justice and things of those nature, those things. You know, we're still waiting for a lot of those values that and benefits and rights and privileges that everyone else appreciates. You know, there's still a lot of those things that haven't been successfully experienced from a Native American perspective. There still isn't equal justice. There still isn't, you know, self-determination, true self-determination. When I think about all this, you know, I don't question the choices that they made because I didn't live in their shoes in that time period. But as a young person, when you were young, you know, you went to school till you were maybe the 5th or 6th grade. Then there was decisions that had to be made. Your family was accumulating debt, and you had a couple of choices. Do you go live in a non-native's house and be an indentured servant in a domestic area, or do you go out on a whaling vessel and risk your life traveling all over the world? And a lot of our natives went into that field and were indentured, but the money was never their own. It never really went back, and they weren't able to benefit from it because of the peonage system. And these stories, as I said, they're very difficult to read over, but they make us think about, you know, how to correct that and Harvard's role in all that. Harvard has played a significant role in the development of Indian policy from the beginning. And we have to take a hard look at what you were teaching, because a lot of the graduates that came out of here have gone on to influence government at the federal level, at the state level. Even today, a lot of people are tapped to serve in government roles that are coming out of Harvard. So they still have that power to influence change and policy. And what I'd like to see as a result of this conference and other things is to where Harvard takes an asserted effort to try to help the tribes and work with the tribes and do comparative papers to understand, the injustices that were done and how to take corrective actions to move forward, to create a better opportunity for Native Americans, because we have lost so much, and try to achieve some of the values and civil liberties and things that everyone else appreciates, such as equal justice under the law and things of that nature. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists for that wealth of information that you shared with us this morning. We have maybe 14 minutes for Q&A, and I thank everyone who has entered a question via Slido. I'm going to ask a question of each panelist, and I'm going to stack a couple of questions and ask if you can kind of do some magic tricks and keep your responses succinct. So, Andres, I'd like to start with you. We have a question on Slido that's asking why it is that the Spanish ended Indigenous enslavement earlier. And I'd like to attach to that a question about environmental history. We've heard about land in everybody's presentations. I wonder if you could tell us about this concept you have of a landscape of predation.
Sure. So thank you. So first, even from medieval times, the Iberian kingdoms believed that slavery was the last resort, the result of terrible punishment. So that's why even at the very beginning of colonization, the enslavement of natives was permitted only, as I said, under unusual circumstances like cannibalism, or if you had ransomed somebody who was already enslaved by other indigenous group, you could legally keep that. So in the face of this terrible decimation, especially of the Caribbean during the first half of the 19th century, people saw the need to do something really radical to stop this, and that was the origins of that. As for your second question, and I very briefly, I have been working with some archaeologists to bring this even broader, because, I mean, we've talked about Indian slavery in this particular 500-year story, but you could go even to Vikings, establishing outposts in Britain, for example, or others. And so we've come with this idea of the predatory landscape, which is a geography, a space primarily characterized by predatory practices, such as labor, coercion, enslavement, encroachment, exploitation of resources, and so on, that you can take to all times through history and to other geographies. So thank you.
Thank you. You did it. Margaret, we have a question about the differences between the enslavement of Africans and of Indigenous people. You began to address that in your comments. I wonder if you could say more and maybe explain what predatory slavery is. And I'd like to attach to that a question about where kinship fits into this.
Oh, those are both great questions. So I think for a long time, historians just assumed that slavery was hereditary in New England, but the statute doesn't say that. It doesn't specify its hereditary nature. So this was, therefore, slavery had to be kind of renewed and contested every generation. So what New Englanders who had or wanted enslaved labor would say is that this is the custom of the country. It's the custom of civilized places, as Virginia, Barbados, and other places had established the hereditary nature of slavery by the 1650s, 1660s. It had become a common practice. So they're arguing that this is how it works everywhere else, it should work this way. And I also want to emphasize that slavery took a village. It took the enforcement activity of an entire community to keep people enslaved. There's not a police presence. These are decentralized, mostly rural places. So, these were community decisions, whether they were going to let people get away with enslaving over generations or not. So I think there's that. There's sort of the pressure that African slavery brought with it to make it a harsher slave regime, and the way the indigeneity of the slave regime pushed back against that. I think that the kinship question both involves, it can work on a couple of levels. We could think about these households that were raising all these indigenous children, that they forcibly kidnapped and brought into, as, these funny places of fictive kinship. And yet, what was the emotional, what was emotional life in these households for these children for whom these were, in some cases, the only parents they knew or remembered, and yet they were slaveholders? What was that? What was emotionally? What was that like? I think also, though, of the titanic efforts that enslaved people made to stay in touch with their communities, of mothers and fathers who advocated for their children and tried to arrange visits to home communities, participation in ritual, attendance in funerals. The communities of free Indians continued to practice ritual, and servants of all races actually attended fairs and religious ceremonies and other events. So kind of the fight to maintain kinship that slavery was constantly trying to tear apart, tearing husbands from wives and parents from children. So those are two ways I would think about kinship.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. David Silverman, it's November, and we are heading toward one of the biggest U.S. national holidays of the year. You've written a book about this holiday, and I think it's probably fair to say that much of the information shared on this panel contrasts with the narrative, just a little bit, that we have about Thanksgiving. So would you share with us some thoughts about the mythology of Thanksgiving, the meaning of Thanksgiving as related to our panel?
Sure. Most people don't think very hard about this Thanksgiving myth of pilgrims and Indians making friends, even as American society indoctrinates young people in it, having them make cardboard cutouts and perform Thanksgiving pageants with that kind of imagery. My experience is that when you ask almost any reasonable adult, recognizing that there are many unreasonable adults, but when you ask any reasonable adult, do you really think a shared meal is the appropriate symbol of Indian colonial relations? Almost to a person, they will acknowledge, probably not. But very few of them can explain why. Because this society has worked very, very hard to tell narratives of indigenous people consenting to colonialism. Almost all the native people who are well known in American history are the Indians who helped. Squanto, Sacagawea, right? I mean, we can go right on down Pocahontas. But that wasn't normal. The bloodshed, the genocide is what's normal. And, as we've seen in our politics of late, a sizable portion of the American public thinks the purpose of a history education is to make people feel patriotic. This history will not make you feel patriotic. So, my position is, if we're going to attach the story of pilgrims and Wampanoags, not Indians, they're usually anonymous in the story, but then get the history straight. I don't think anyone's going to want to do that. You can celebrate Thanksgiving without invoking that myth, and then we can handle the real complex history and difficult history in history courses. That's my position on all of this. I have a feeling I'm spitting into the wind, but nevertheless, Pemedicom had it right, which is why I shared that story with you.
I wonder if anybody in this room knows how to make a bumper sticker. Medicom had it right. Try that one. So, David Weeden, we have a number of questions on Slido that are addressing what you spoke about at the end of your comments. That is the question of, what does all this mean? How can the people who are learning about these new ideas and events to them respond? What should they do? This is a big question and a hard question, I know, but I wonder if you could just share some thoughts that come to your mind about what can people in the audience do? What should they do with this new knowledge?
There's a lot of things, I know everyone's doing the land acknowledgement statements and things like that, but, stuff like that is a very low bar. For me, I don't see a lot of value in it. It's not intended, it's a land acknowledgement statement, so it's not intended to be a historic overview or educational lesson on history. I get, as a historic preservation officer, I get a lot of phone calls asking me, hey, we want to do this land acknowledgement. Can you help me write it? No, it shouldn't be in my voice. I know what you did. And for people that suggest, we should read it at every meeting. I don't want to hear every meeting that you stole my land. So stuff like that, it's low-hanging fruit to make the other people, the oppressor, feel good about themselves in acknowledging something. But, let's look at actions. I want to see actions that you are meaningfully trying to tell the story accurately. Stop perpetuating lies. Stop celebrating Columbus, that was an atrocious person in this day and age. Tell the true story of, how Thanksgiving, it's a myth. So, I don't know what to do with that. Our celebration is National Day of Mourning on that day. And so land back, have those conversations. Are there opportunities to give land back? Are there opportunities to empower tribes, work with tribes? Tribes are challenged with resources to be able to do all the things that they need to do. And so if you have a skill set, whether it's writing, research, any of those things, offer time. Offer time is meaningful. That shows that you care. That shows, giving of oneself is the highest sign of respect. And so doing things like that, offering your time to tribes and things in ways that they need, advocating for tribes. I'd love to see where tribes have a voice in the State House. We're domestic dependent nations within a state, within local municipalities. So with that, the trust responsibilities, Massachusetts doesn't really recognize that tribes, they have 2 federal recognized tribes here that are as a body of politic and a sovereign, we're higher than the state and those local municipalities, yet we're affected by decisions of the legislature each and every day that challenge our way of life and our lifeways and Aboriginal rights and things. We should have a voice in those decisions. Things like that would be a meaningful way to change in a positive direction.
Thank you, and I think that's a meaningful place to end. Thank you to our panelists.